Greetings and welcome to the Residence of Evil. Beggy here. I hope you don't mind this certain someone walking beside us. Previously, we explored some of the lesser-known lore of Resident Evil 4 regarding the origins of Osmond Saddler, Las Plagas, and the Ganados. Tonight, let's dive deeper into one of the largest and most iconic bioweapons born of Las Plagas, El Gigante. Now, beyond what you might already know about this beast from the game itself, some fascinating new info on it was recently made available. A scrapped RE4 game file that was translated and shared by Project Umbrella. This file, along with a few others, only existed in preview builds of the game. Similar to how George Trevor's notes were cut from the early builds of RE1, which shed light on the mansion's items, the files cut from RE4 potentially reveal more details about the game than we've ever known. By analyzing them, we can speculate how these elements might resurface in the Resident Evil 4 remake. So the first scrapped file pertains to El Gigante. While we know it is one of many possible mutations produced by implanting the Plaga parasite into a human body, its precise creation process is perhaps the most mysterious of them all. Most Plaga-based bioweapons possess abilities and appearances that are at least loosely indicative of how they are engineered. For example, the Verdugo was produced by fusing together human and insect DNA through gene splicing, and the Novistador presumably contains elements from insects as well, despite having a human base. Then we have Del Lago, which was created by implanting a Plaga parasite into a salamander host. In all of these cases, the resulting bioweapon itself is a reflection of how it was engineered. Even the Regenerator carries multiple Plaga parasites in its body as opposed to one, a characteristic that immediately distinguishes its engineering process from that of other Plaga-based BOWs. But El Gigante has no such distinct traits to tell us more about its origins. Like the Novistador, we know that El Gigante resulted from various Plaga experiments conducted on human hosts, but aside from that, we aren't given a definitive rationale for its huge size or its lowered intelligence compared to the Ganados. So the question is, what precisely causes a human host to mutate into El Gigante? This is actually one of the most elusive details of the game's lore. Multiple wiki pages on this creature dodge this particular question and proceed to explain everything else about El Gigante that we already know. The Monster Wiki, for instance, states that its size was dramatically increased through an unknown method, and both the Capcom database and the RE Neoseeker Wiki state the same thing. Now, while these three sites aren't exactly the go-to for Resident Evil lore, they certainly demonstrate the ambiguous nature of its creature's origins. So before looking at the scrapped file on El Gigante, let's visit a much more specialized and reliable resource, the Resident Evil Wiki. But here again, the answer isn't exactly satisfying. The History tab states that El Gigante first resulted from experimenting on human hosts with Las Plagas. Consequently, a small number of them were produced and arranged around the village and beneath the castle. So, in short, it claims that the method of mutation was first discovered and then used to deliberately create more of them. The Biology tab explains this with an external lore file from the RE.net site. This file states that El Gigante was created through Plaga implantation and genetic manipulation. Well, genetic manipulation is vague enough of a rationale to apply to virtually any Plaga-based creature. It's still rather inconclusive reasoning compared to those of the other BOWs, but it's now accepted as correct, and it's not like every creature has or requires an explanation to begin with. So, that's it, right? Mystery solved. But still,
something's not right.
Note that this external file on El Gigante wasn't uploaded until 2012, which is years after even the release of Resident Evil 5. It feels like a loose end being tied up 7 years later in a very safe, inconsequential manner. It makes you wonder if this is the rationale that the writers always intended. Because it's not. Let's finally take a look at the scrapped file. It reads, "Important notes on followers under purification. Those going through purification must be placed in confinement and kept under watch by multiple people due to them temporarily going berserk. In this case, not even family may approach them. Without my approval, they cannot be set free of their confinement, as there are some who may pretend to come to their senses and try to slip away that way. If they stay in that state for too long, there exists the possible danger of them turning into an El Gigante." Fascinating. If you've read or seen our analysis videos on the RE4 prequel novel, also known as Biohazard 4 Incubate, you know that purification refers to Sadler's men injecting Las Plagas into the villagers' bodies. Sadler claims that the so-called sacred blood will cleanse their impure souls, and with the help of Chief Mendez, he manipulates them into receiving it. So although the file's writer is unnamed, these are most likely the notes of either Chief Mendez or Sadler himself. After the parasite attaches itself to a host's nervous system, the host sporadically enters fits of rage before learning to maintain control over their faculties. During this unstable period, the host must be watched to ensure that their minds can withstand the Plaga's influence, and only the writer of this file can make such a judgment. The writer suspects that some carriers may pretend to regain their bearings between outbursts, unaware that the parasite may spark rage in them once again. And finally, those whose minds remain in these precarious states for too long are at risk of mutating into an El Gigante. So there you have it. In its initial writing, or at least in some point during its conception, it seems that El Gigante was not designed deliberately through genetic manipulation. Rather, it was a horrific consequence of a host's nervous system losing its battle to a plaga entirely. While the majority of ganados learn to keep their parasite's influence in check, some would be fatally dominated by it, thus being rendered slaves to the parasite itself, which explains the El Gigante's reduced intelligence and therefore its lack of controllability. So while this file implies that El Gigante has resulted from unfortunate happenstance, the current rationale of deliberately producing them through genetic manipulation is technically the correct explanation. But despite this, the scrapped file's reasoning is arguably better supported by the game's lore than the current one. Let's refer back to the prequel novel for a moment. Rodrigo's friend, who invites him over for dinner in Chapter 5, is the first villager mentioned to suddenly exhibit violent behavior, and this is because he actually inhaled spores of Las Plagas while working in the mines. This makes him one of the first villagers to ever mentally grapple with a parasite. After this, Rodrigo notes that this same man, his friend, doesn't attend Sadler's sermons. This man is never mentioned again, not even in the scene when Sadler administers Las Plagas to the villagers. So could it be that Rodrigo's friend never reverted back from his violent state, continued to avoid the sermons, and by having his nervous system usurped by the parasite eventually, mutated into El Gigante himself? It's certainly plausible, and the little that were offered in-game on El Gigante, in Lewis's third memo, states that it was a byproduct of Plaga experimentation, and that's exactly what the scrap file makes it sound like, an unintentional byproduct of failing to create a more reliable bioweapon, like a standard ganado. If these creatures are such a danger to the ganados, why deliberately create 3 more of them through genetic manipulation anyway? It really does seem more likely that those who worked in the mines, and perhaps those who resisted Sadler's orders during the purification process, are the real reason why 4 of them came to exist, by succumbing to the Plaga's influence in its entirety. So, what do you think? Were they created deliberately or unintentionally? And how do you think they'll be explained in the Resident Evil 4 remake? Let us know down in the comments. Before we say goodbye, the Duke would like a word with you on our sponsor, G Fuel.
Do you have need of anything for the road ahead? The Residence of Evil has expanded its services. Perhaps you're in need of a little pick-me-up. I recommend the G Fuel. You can even get a fair discount if you use the code ROE upon purchase. And as always, we thank you for your patronage, stranger.
I'll see you again soon, I'm sure. Until then, subscribe, or El Gigante just might burst out of your closet.